They're fascinated by these very complicated and challenging ideas. As well, they might be 10 years on, but they're also worried by them, I think. They're also confused and often at odds with their parents. Not at odds with their parents because their parents don't wish to discuss them, but it's a sort of whole language and culture that, unless you spend an awful long time reading into it, as I've done, you wouldn't necessarily even know what your kids are talking about, or that there's potentially something, rather dangerous about it.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, I sit down with Jo-Anne Nadler, a writer, journalist and concerned parent. Jo-Anne released a report with Civitas think tank about critical social justice undermining schools through radical teachings on race, gender and sexuality.
As many as 41% of the pupils had actually been taught during lessons that young men are currently a problem for society.
Really?
Now, if you are a young man, if you're a young boy, if you're a teenage boy and you're trying to come to terms with your own identity, then to have that very sort of innate negative messaging, I would suggest isn't necessarily going to help you be a better friend to girls.
Jo-Anne talks about how parents can group together to combat what she calls a revolution.
There are a lot of parents who are deeply, deeply concerned about this, and you only have to look at social media and across the board to see that the groups are sort of springing up. But often parents feeling that they have to remain anonymous.
I'm Lee Hall. This is British Thought Leaders. Jo-Anne Nadler, thank you for joining us on British Thought Leaders. You released a report on critical social justice in schools. Could you talk to us a bit about what critical social justice is and what you found?
Of course, Lee, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I think I should probably start by saying that, I'm not an academic. I am a concerned parent. I'm a journalist. I've had a career in and around politics, both as a reporter and also in some cases as a campaigner. And at various points I've been involved with the Conservative Party. But I guess these days I think of myself primarily as a writer and a campaigning parent. And critical social justice isn't really a concept that I was particularly aware of, certainly not in a sort of practical sense, not in an applied sense, until I guess 3 or 4 years ago. And I think at that stage I would have thought about it as being a set of philosophical and ideological ideas primarily drawn from the left, but it wouldn't really have had very much of an immediate effect on my everyday life. It's only really been the last, 2 or 3 years since I've seen various developments in my son's school and in the schools of children of friends of mine, that I've really become fascinated by this whole world, which seems to be, if you like, entering into schools as it is with many of our other institutions, and introducing a set of values and I have to say an ideology which somewhat runs counter to the liberal framework that we have essentially valued and respected in this country for the most part. You ask what I would describe critical social justice as. I mean, as far as I can see, it seems to be a way of looking at the world which sees the world as being essentially based on relationships of hierarchy and relationships of exploitation. So it is, many people would say it's a sort of derivation of Marxism. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. But very, very crudely put, I guess Marxism would see the exploiter as being the capitalist, the industrialist, exploiting the worker. And critical social justice ranges over a number of different identities that are a lot more complicated than just being a worker. And, essentially, it depends whether you see race as being your primary identity marker, whether it's your sexuality, whether it's your gender, which is something we're hearing a whole load more about now. And critical social justice, it seems to me, is attempting to not only interpret the world wholly through that lens, but also to create a sort of hermetically sealed vision in which it not only posits the problem is that, you know, if you're white and heterosexual and male, you're almost certainly an exploiter in this system, but it also presupposes the answer to that. So that's what I mean about hermetically sealed. It's not saying, well, this might be what's wrong with the world, let's investigate it. It's essentially saying this is what's wrong with the world, and in order to correct it, you then have to take action, which is broadly speaking described as achieving equity in whichever of these categories you consider yourself to be, to have been abused or shall we say, exploited.
So you describe what's happened in schools as a revolution. So what's the scale and severity of the problem?
Well, to my mind, it's a revolution because I think it's unpicking what we, certainly my generation, I'm in my 50s, I've got a teenage son, but certainly what we would have considered to be the essential nature of education, which is teaching people how to think, not necessarily teaching them what to think. Teaching people what to think is more in tune with an idea of training, or dare I say even indoctrination. And if you apply to a school setting this hermetically sealed kind of self-perpetuating ideology which says this is what the problem in society is and this is how you solve it, then you're essentially making it much more difficult for children to form their own judgment as to what the problem might be and how they should solve it. Now, to a certain extent, I guess people would always say that there have been prevailing values that have informed a school setting, even in a democracy, even in a liberal democracy. But broadly speaking, those values have been in tune with what I'd call, you know, the democratic norms and the majoritarian view within that society. What we seem to have been seeing over the last, you know, I guess it's increasingly over the last decade, and as far as gender ideology is concerned, I guess over the last, you know, relatively very, very rapid period, perhaps over the last 5 years or so, is the inclusion in schools, and in a very concerted way, not just in individual strands of education like the sex education class, as it were, but sort of peppered throughout the curriculum and introduced into sort of extracurricular activities and in the assemblies and things like that. These ideas that, you know, many people would think do not reflect a majoritarian view. I wouldn't say they shouldn't be discussed in school, although I would draw the line at some of them. But broadly speaking, I do personally take a liberal approach, which is by all means introduce ideas, but you have to make sure that they're being discussed fairly and rationally, that you explain that they aren't necessarily the only solution to the problem or even the only problem. And I think this is my concern and why I've tended towards using this slightly provocative language by describing it as a revolution. The other reason I describe it as a revolution is because I think not only is it undermining, you know, the essential values of what I consider schooling to be, not only is it leading to a situation where, you know, traditional topics in the curriculum, let's say history and English, are being completely sort of rethought because activists would suggest that a traditional curriculum only embeds further this hierarchy of exploitation. But we're seeing, if you like, schools under pressure from different ends of the system. So you have got, and I hesitate to say activists, because I don't want to give the impression that I think there's an army of activists eating away at the bedrock of schools. I think it's more sophisticated than that. But I do think that there are agents coming into schools who have ideas which we would previously have considered partisan, and they're being presented as though they are fact, as though they are beyond discussion.
So I know you did some polling as part of your report. I think some of the results that you got really spell out for people what it is that you're actually talking about. Could you talk to us about some of that?
Yes, of course, Lee. So I wrote this report with a think tank called Civitas, and essentially I wanted to have some time to reflect on what's going on, where these trends have come from, what the source of them might be, and what, if anything, we should do about them, what we could do about them. But we wanted to find a way to illustrate in a sort of practical way, wider than just my own ruminations on all of this, how this manifests in school. So we did ask Delta Poll to commission a poll for us, both of parents and also of school-aged children between 16 and 18.
Right.
And we asked a lot of questions ranging across a number of these different aspects of critical social justice. So we asked about gender ideology, we asked about how race is treated in school, we asked about aspects that have occurred in the relationships and sex education strand of schooling, which is causing quite a lot of anxiety to many parents simply because of the very explicit nature of some of the material that is now finding its way into school, even at primary level. And one of the things that started to make me anxious about this whole area, and which prompted me to start investigating it, was first of all the reaction in many schools, but particularly in my son's school, in the schools that were neighbouring schools, very quickly in the summer of 2020 to the Black Lives Matter protests. Now, Black Lives Matter was obviously something that caught the imagination of many young people, and therefore it was being discussed in schools. Inevitably it will be, and it was. But I was struck by the way that we received as parents a letter from the head teacher, only really days after the murder of George Floyd, suggesting that the school was thinking about how they might reflect on this, whether they might review some of their curriculum, whether they might review some of their school practices. And this struck me as quite extraordinary because my son was then, I think, 12 or 13. He'd been at school, obviously, for some time. And during that period, there will have been any number of remarkable political events.
Yeah.
There had been wars, there had been terrorist attacks, but we'd never received anything from the school to suggest that the school needed to take a view on these things. So that got my mind rolling.
And that was in America, wasn't it? George Floyd. It wasn't even here.
It wasn't even here, but obviously, as you know, as I recognise, it did become a movement that was reflected in this country, and we saw the introduction very quickly of some very partisan teaching materials, ironically, into the religious studies area of the curriculum.
Right.
So one of the questions we asked, and this obviously is now 3 years on, but in the polling was, and this was to the 16 to 18-year-olds, was whether they'd been taught in lessons, so we were quite specific about that, that Britain used to be a racist country. Yeah. Now, that's obviously a matter of argument and interpretation, but 69% of the children that we spoke to said yes, they had been taught that. Only 27% said they had not been taught that. Right. That's obviously a historical perspective, one that I would argue with, but nevertheless, it's worth having the argument. I think slightly more alarmingly was the 42% of the pupils who said that they are being taught that Britain is currently a racist country.
Right.
42% being taught that Britain is currently a racist country, I think is pretty alarming. I mean, it's an assertion. It's something that needs to be backed up with evidence. And in many ways, it's a very worrying thing to be taught in a school environment because we live in a multicultural society, which is a very positive thing on the whole. And I think if you're then teaching children within that multicultural society that it's an endemically racist society, potentially you're creating any number of grievances and psychological disruptions to impressionable children. You asked me earlier about what critical social justice is, and I think it spans a number of different ideologies across different identities. In a sense, probably the most controversial of those, and certainly the most controversial in my mind in a school setting, is this issue of gender, this suggestion that gender is separate from biological sex, that there can be any number of genders, that gender is fluid, that you can one day decide to identify as one gender, then potentially the next as another gender. This kind of idea that there are no fixed points is very difficult, I think, for children to navigate, let alone for adults to navigate. And it would seem to go beyond the perfectly reasonable expectations that schools should help children to be broad-minded and compassionate. Now, we asked the pupils that we spoke to a number of questions on in this area of the report. And for instance, we asked them whether any of them had been told or taught at school by a teacher or someone else who'd been invited to speak to the school. So it could be an external sex education consultancy, for instance. Yeah. Had any of them been taught that sex is assigned at birth? Now, for those of your viewers who might be a little bit confused by that statement, it's an expression that has become synonymous with gender ideology. Implicit in it is the idea that sex can be assigned at birth. It is not biologically correct. Sex is not assigned at birth. So therefore, it was somewhat surprising that 67% of the pupils that we spoke to said, yes, sex is assigned at birth is something that they had been taught at school.
So we're talking 2 out of 3, basically.
Yeah. Now, again, I would advise caution in interpreting any figures. It is possible, and I'm sort of, playing devil's advocate here, I guess. It's possible that that expression would come up in a lesson and thereafter be conditionally dismissed, as I have done. But we can't necessarily assume that. It's a controversial partisan statement. 67% of the pupils that we spoke to said they'd encountered it at school, in a lesson, not in the playground. The other figure that quite a lot of the press coverage picked up on was the question to pupils about whether they know of anybody at their school, including themselves, who may have considered changing gender or were still thinking about doing so. And we found that 54% of those pupils, now bear in mind they are between 16 and 18, they're not primary age pupils, indeed had considered that or were considering. And a further 10% said yes, they were themselves going through this consideration process. Now, again, it's possible they may have considered it for half an hour and totally dismissed it. We don't know. And that's why it is important, I think, to be very cautious and not to sort of scaremonger around these figures. But they're a snapshot. They tell us that these ideas are now widely discussed in schools. And I certainly know from my own experience that, a lot of the young people in my son's cohort, in my larger family, they come home from school and they're routinely discussing issues to do with gender. They're not coming home from school and discussing, the great book they're reading in English, how fascinating the Wars of Roses are, how great to learn, how bridges are held up. Any of the things that, if you like, might form the core element of a curriculum. They're fascinated by these very complicated and challenging ideas. As well, they might be 10 years on, but they're also worried by them, I think. They're also confused and often at odds with their parents. Not at odds with their parents because their parents don't wish to discuss them, but it's a sort of whole language and culture that, unless you spend an awful long time reading into it, as I've done, you wouldn't necessarily even know what your kids are talking about, or that there's potentially something, rather dangerous about it.
Before we move on from the stats, a couple of other things that interested me. The first one being, because I know we're having issues now with birth rate decline, etc. And there was a polling about having children and related to climate change.
Yeah, this was intriguing, actually, because as you quite rightly say, I have to admit this wasn't an area that I particularly knew a great deal about, the issue of the fact that, in fact, across the world now we have a declining birth rate. And that's not something that's very often considered. But in that context, I think it's particularly interesting that when we asked the pupils about their concerns over climate change, 50% of the pupils we spoke to said that people should have fewer children to prevent overpopulation and climate change. Now, that obviously has the potential to change. You know, I mean, how many of us thought about having children when we were 16? Yeah. But then again, how many of us would have thought we wouldn't have children and for such a reason? So that, I think, was interesting. And actually, we also specifically asked them about their views on, or their concerns about, really the longevity of the world. And 53% overall said that they felt, as a result of climate change, the world is likely to end in their lifetime. Really? Now, I think that's a very startling figure as well. People have said to me, and I think with good reason, that perhaps a generation ago we might have seen nuclear war as being a potential threat in that way, or previously perhaps famine, or I mean, well, there are sort of existential terrors that teenagers are inclined to have, but it does suggest that perhaps the teaching about climate change in schools may have a tendency to be too alarmist.
We've had a few people on the show talking about the problems facing men and boys these days. And I know you had a question about that.
Yes, because we did ask about this, because one of the one of this very sort of obvious trends that seems to have been happening both in wider society but also in schools very specifically is this whole discussion of toxic masculinity, which is tied into this other critical social justice trope of heteronormativity. And also, to a certain extent, with the wider implications of what exactly do we mean when we talk about gender stereotyping. I had certainly noticed in our experience that a lot of boys are coming under, I would say, a very negative framing to what could be a sensible and positive approach to just engendering respect for for girls, essentially, and respect for each other. But there seems to be a negative way of framing this that is leading boys to think that somehow there's something intrinsically wrong about them. So we found that as many as 41% of the pupils had actually been taught during lessons that young men are currently a problem for society. Really? Now, if you are a young man, if you're a young boy, if you're a teenage boy and you're trying to come to terms with your own identity, then to have that very sort of innate negative messaging, I would suggest isn't necessarily going to help you be a better friend to girls.
No, especially if it's coming from someone you trust, such as a teacher.
Well, quite. I mean, one outcome of it could be that you end up feeling rather lost, resentful, lacking in confidence, which are not great starting points for being a better contributor to society overall. So, I think that we have big questions to ask about this whole narrative, and whether, even if taken at face value, that it's meant to be a positive thing, a constructive thing, to help young people to be better attuned to people who are different to themselves for whatever reason, and to be better equipped to take a positive role in society. I think a lot of the direction of travel of these various different threads of the ideology actually end up dividing people even more and making people potentially feel, more at odds with each other than they would otherwise have been.
Have you got anything about children who may not agree with all this stuff? How do you think they would feel?
Well, I think that our polling was interesting on this, because what we found was that some schools obviously are managing to discuss these contentious issues in a sort of holistic way, and in a way that enables and encourages children to express different opinions. But curiously, and perhaps worryingly, this may be a sign of what outside schools has become labelled cancel culture. We found evidence that pupils that we spoke to felt that they couldn't really express an opinion freely if it somehow contradicted the sort of prevailing fashion or orthodoxy on some of these political issues, because they were worried about being bullied by other pupils, even if the school itself had taken a pluralistic approach. So I'll just give you the figures exactly. 46% of the pupils that we spoke to, overall 46%, said that they did not feel comfortable contributing an opinion on contentious issues like gender, sexuality and sex, because they felt that it could lead to them being judged or bullied by other students. Right. 46%. Now, I'm going to break those figures down. That included 35% of pupils who expressed that opinion even if they felt their school was doing its level best to encourage other opinions.
Right.
So, that suggests that there is a sort of societal move, a real sort of judgmental quality to the wider public discussion on this. And it's, I think, particularly a shame if pupils don't feel they can express alternative positions in school, because that's a situation where you should be encouraged to debate, to think, to discuss, and to review different opinions.
You mentioned in your report that this is a revolution delivered by stealth. Who is behind all of this?
When it first became apparent to me that this was happening, I rather naively thought, well, hang on a second. The schools are essentially governed by the Education Act. And it is true and very important that there are strong clauses in the Education Act that demand impartiality and that political partisan ideas aren't appropriate without proper wider discussion. However, the Education Act is very, very far from the only piece of legislation that affects schools. And what seems to have happened, particularly since the Blair government, is the rise in importance of the equalities legislation, right, the creation of so-called protected characteristics, and the obligation on schools and indeed all public sector organisations, and indeed many private sector organisations, to protect the protected characteristics of different people.
What role are third-party providers play?
So I feel quite sympathetic to schools and to teachers, because they have now this huge raft of responsibilities, not just to teach children and to get them through exams, but also, it would seem, to inculcate a host of different values. And often what I think is happening is that the school leadership team don't feel confident in this new area, and they call upon experts, and it's a bit of a what they consider to be experts. It's a bit of a self-perpetuating cycle, this, because you have these self-styled experts on often on gender, often on sex education, and on race-related matters as well, who set up consultancies. These are sometimes very well-funded charities, and they offer to deliver this part of the curriculum, the part of the curriculum that your regular geography teacher, let's say, may not feel completely competent in doing. And I think this is where a lot of the more radical end of the agenda seems to be coming into schools. There is essentially an industry now of these third-party providers, some of whom I'm sure are very competent, some of whom I'm sure are very well-intended, but not all of them are. What they have been, what I've found in looking at a lot of the websites involved, is that certainly until very recently, they were pretty blatant about the fact that they were political operators.
Right.
Now, they may not have seen it in those terms, but if you describe, let's say, your sex education offer as being intersectional, as being there to address the gender imbalance between the sexes, as being essential in order that pupils know how to navigate a world that's inherently racist. And, extraordinary claims that are being made, quite blatantly so, by agencies who, I will give the benefit of the doubt. I would say maybe they are deeply sincere in this worldview, but it is a particular worldview. It's not an impartial worldview, and it's a worldview that I think many parents may question how pertinent it is to sex education.
Yeah.
So the obligation on schools now, the public sector equality duty, the complications arising from ever more prescriptive legislation around personal health, social education, relationships, sex education, or as the Welsh call it, sexuality education, and health. I mean, this whole agenda has grown exponentially, really, over the last 15 years, certainly. And I think, again, many parents would be surprised that sex education bears, very little resemblance to anything about what we might have imagined sex education to be about, essentially, perhaps preventing teenage pregnancies, preventing the spread of sexually transmitted infections. And it's become very much more about lifestyle choices, identity issues, subjective considerations of what sexual pleasure may be, even introduced really to quite young children. I would say all parents need to engage with what their schools are teaching.
So what's the government doing in response to concerns such as the ones you're raising here? And I know there's other reports that have done similar. And also the devolved governments, because I know it's a bit different in Scotland and Wales.
Well, I can't say what the Scottish and Welsh governments are doing about this, except that it doesn't seem to be in any way positive or in line with the concerns of parents. In Wales, there's been a very concerted effort to protest outside the Welsh Senedd fairly regularly about the fact that parents now have no alternative but to submit their children to an embedded relationship sexuality education, as it's called in Wales. There's no disguising the fact that it's not what we would previously have called sex education. They're very open about the aims of it, and that's now to be embedded in the curriculum for children. Excuse me, I believe from age 4 upwards. Now, there's a very plucky group of campaigners in Wales that have been trying to do something about this, and they're currently involved in various court cases. But that doesn't, augur well to the idea that the Welsh government is receptive to being moderate about this. The Scottish government is also very, under the SNP, is also very committed to this agenda, and was really proud of the fact that it was in the forefront of this idea of embedding these ideologies throughout the curriculum. Parents do have some limited rights, certainly in England and in Scotland, though I believe slightly less so there, to withdraw their children from the very narrow element of this broader agenda, which you can specifically argue is to do with sex education.
Right.
And even then, it's only up until 3 terms before a child's 16th birthday. But as to what the government in this country or in England is doing, clearly Rishi Sunak has woken up to the fact that parents are getting very concerned about this. And I have to give credit, absolute credit, to 2 very important reports that have also come out this year. And that is one from the new Social Covenant Unit, which is about the very explicit nature of sex education. And I really would recommend that people look that up and read it, because the evidence there is quite staggering, really. And then the other one, which is from Policy Exchange, which was called Asleep at the Wheel. And that looks at the very, very broad spread of gender ideology into schools. Now, you take the two of them, and the evidence is very, very compelling that these are significant problems.
What can other concerned parents out there, or just concerned people generally, do?
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing I'd say to that is it's sort of inform yourself, find out what is going on in your school and whether there is something that you should be concerned about. It may be that you're perfectly happy with what your school is doing. I'm not saying that this is being rolled out uniformly, but it's very widely spread. I mean, I think that the legislative requirements on schools obviously are universal in that sense. But some schools will take a more moderate approach to this, and others throw themselves into it wholeheartedly. I've certainly noticed in the independent sector, which obviously only represents a minority of schools, but nevertheless sees itself as being, if you like, and sometimes they even use this expression, certain schools, thought leaders in this area. Innovators, they see themselves as innovators of this because obviously they're trying to sell themselves, literally sell themselves, and often sell themselves to overseas purchasers of this education. So I certainly, in my own survey and in the own research that I've done, have found that independent schools are very much at the forefront of the more radical end of a lot of this material. And parents do need to engage in this. Unfortunately, it's no longer the case that you can, send your children to school and trust that they're going to be, in, I was about to say safe hands. That's safeguarding is a specific aspect of this, but that the values of the school will necessarily accord with the values of family life. So get yourself informed. And then I think, you have to start, if there's something that you don't like, you have to start taking action. Now, for the reasons that I've said, the legal rights that you have are pretty limited. But what I've seen is that there's definitely a sort of grassroots movement growing of parents that are concerned across a number of different areas. Perhaps, and quite understandably, the most pressing one is around the issue of the normalisation of gender ideology in schools, not least because it seemed to have coincided with an extraordinary rise, as our polling showed, but specifically with regards to teenage girls, of what many people see as a social contagion of teenage girls really questioning their own gender identity, having really absorbed this idea in many cases that gender is somehow different to sex, that you might even be able to change your sex, referring for psychological, or as the Americans have framed it, euphemistically gender-affirming care. And I think affirmation is the key word there, because the direction of travel of a lot of the psychological industry as well seems, or profession rather, seems to be this idea that you affirm in a way that we would never have considered, for instance, affirming a teenage girl who presented with an eating disorder. So quite understandably, there are a lot of parents who are deeply, deeply concerned about this, and you only have to look at social media and across the board to see that the groups are sort of springing up, but often parents feeling that they have to remain anonymous. I mean, I certainly found at our school that when I started to raise issues about how these things were being discussed, parents were privately saying to me, well, we think you're doing the right thing, but, we're a bit concerned about this and we don't want to be seen to be prejudiced or we don't want our motives to be misinterpreted. I mean, people were genuinely, I wouldn't say scared, but they were very, very cautious and hesitant about putting their head above the parapet. This idea that gender is fluid, it seems to be very widely spread in schools. And we had the option at our school, well, it wasn't presented as an option, it was presented as a fait accompli, of two agencies that were coming in to talk to the children who were at that stage aged between, so it was covering an age group across 11 through to 16. And these agencies were going to talk to them about a number of issues in the sexuality and gender spectrum. And I just looked them up online, and their materials were really explicit, really, biologically not sound. I tried to engage other parents with this. They were concerned and alarmed, but they weren't really quite sure what to do about it, up until the point where some of the fathers started to get involved, and they realised they're going onto the websites of these agencies, and they were finding materials which I'm laughing now because I was just trying to imagine the face of the head teacher when she received the letter from the father with the screenshot of the materials that was on the front page of this very well-known sex education agency. And he just said, why is this being taught in my schools when I wouldn't be able to show it to anybody in my professional setting? That basically if he had gone into his office, printed off this material and distributed it amongst his colleagues, he would probably have ended up with an HR issue.
Though, according to government figures, 41% of children leaving primary school are struggling with the basics, reading, writing, maths. So there is an argument that maybe we need to kind of pull this ideology aside that's being pushed on the children and focus on the basics, really.
I think there's absolutely an extremely strong argument for that. I mean, even if it were far fewer that were leaving school with those sort of problems, because that's the core purpose of education. And if you equip children, it seems to me, with those tools, then they are equipped to go through life and discover all these other things and make a judgment on them. The problem with treating schools as a sort of breeding ground for ideology is that actually, apart from anything else, apart from where you stand on the ideology, it takes up a great deal of time. And it is essentially getting in the way of teaching the core subjects and giving pupils the solid foundation in knowledge which has been tested and tried over the years, which accords with the values of Britain, rather than having to actually assertively teach them British values. Allow that to come through the texts, allow it to come through the literature, the history. And in so doing, what you actually do then is you create and celebrate, to use a word that's very often used by activists, common values and common points of reference, which I would have thought in and of itself helps to bring society together, helps to create that inclusive, compassionate society, which I think we do all want. That's the irony of all of this. I'm not at all sure, that would be my critique, that if you embed this in the curriculum, if you bend over backwards to try to encourage people to be inclusive, that what you actually end up doing is setting different groups against each other, undermining, as I say, those common values, that common understanding of our historical inheritance, with its strengths as well as its weaknesses, and a love of knowledge for its own sake, an appreciation of beauty, an appreciation of great literature, of music. All of these things, I think, are being undermined by this agenda, and that seems to me to be completely tragic.
Jo-Anne Nadler, thank you for joining us on British Thought Leaders.
My pleasure.